So let's talk about N1 Against the Cult of the Reptile God by Douglas Niles. This is an AD&D module from, well, copyright date 1982. So fairly late in the kind of so-called or so-considered golden era of OD&D basic and AD&D modules. Before, I guess, is Ravenloft 83, before many people would see there as being a genuine and steady decline. And I think that's observable through that middle to late first edition period in terms of modules, and indeed into the kind of the first several years of second edition before the mid-90s Renaissance. So this is a first to third level module, nominally, and it's very famous. It's probably considered by, if you were to take a poll of people who are into, let's just say, first edition modules, this would be in the top 10 of most people who have read widely. And the basic plot is that the adventurers will end up in a village. The village is being taken over by a cult. It's a sort of body snatchers situation where people disappear and then are returned, brainwashed, basically. They're charmed. And they are serving a spirit naga who has a cult base somewhere outside of the town. And so there are essentially two main sections to this. One is basically an investigation in the town, trying to work out what's happening and find out who's who and what the dynamic is. And then once enough evidence is gathered, go off to the base of the Spirit Naga, who is the leader of this cult, and destroy the cult, I guess. That's the basic assumption of the module. And though, of course, you could say that that not requiring parties to act in a particular way. The specific dynamic of this Naga just wants to charm everyone does mean that parties will generally be motivated to oppose it or leave. If they leave, that's fine, but the cult spreads, and they may have to deal with it at a later date. And that is kind of dealt with to a degree, the options around that. So yeah, what to say about this? Well, we've got classic cover with blueprint. That is the village of Overland. Then you've got generally double column text, pretty standard size for first edition in terms of text size, font, etc. You've got a micro booklet, a 4-page booklet of extra maps in the middle. So it's a 32-page module, 28 pages of which are text. There's a temple in the town, the Temple of America. There's 2 levels of dungeon in the external outside of the village base, and then there are 2 inns within, one of which is basically a dungeon, one of which is not. Then there is the description of these locations, and there is a small overland trek. So there's the village description, there are zoom-ins on the temple and the two inns, there is a small overland section, and then there is the dungeon of the reptile god, the spirit naga. And I think the first thing to say about this, there are some real things I'm going to draw out that are criticisms of this that I think should materially impact the way that we rate this compared to T1, which is a comparable adventure in terms of a first level adventure, or U1 or whatever else, B2. It's most similar in terms of the village setup. It'd be natural to see it as similar to T1. The mystery setup obviously is like U1. It is, however, unique that it has this, and this is the strongest thing I think in the whole module, that there is this village with lots of people in it who you can go and talk to and interact with, and they all have different opinions about what's going on. A particular point is made that that people who are not members of the cult are likely to be more suspicious and standoffish than people who are. People who are under some instruction to, deal with outsiders, not all of them will be friendly, but many will be fairly friendly, whereas the people who haven't been replaced but who know something weird is going on with their neighbours, they are more likely to be standoffish. Now that itself is an interesting dynamic. You go in, you hear something weird's going on, that the economy of the area has been affected of this outlying settlement that's nonetheless has great vineyards and produces valuable goods. You go there, and then you find that there are a bunch of people who aren't very friendly to you, but it turns out they might be the good guys. the cleverer thing is actually the way that information is layered, and you could probably have a useful, I would think, chart. You maybe like have a diagram which would show the relationships, because what you have is that different people think different things about different other people, and by this I really mean the uncorrupted members of the village. We know that, for instance, the farmer at number 1, they're suspicious. He understands the town's changed drastically but doesn't know why, and doesn't have an opinion beyond that. The constables, they have been suborned. The dairy farm, the farmer, Noel Graven, is concerned about matters in Orlane but can offer no explanations. So some people just don't know. On the other hand, the weaver says people are strange hereabouts, and that you shouldn't go to the Golden Grain Inn. The liveryman, Killian, can't explain the force at work, but he is very observant. He's suspicious of strangers who moved across the road 2 weeks ago or several weeks ago. He also thinks the Golden Grain Inn is strange, and will mention that his neighbours at the general store disappeared a couple of months ago and then came back, and no explanation of what happened. So he gives you pieces of information there, 2 of which, by the way, are really good, 1 of which is bad. The strangers opposite are 2 elves who have come at the behest of the mayor, their old friend. And so actually those are good guys, but you've got that information that points you towards them being bad guys potentially. Again, the widow at 20 strongly suspects a number of people. The carpenter, the smith, and the carpenter and the smith are cult members. The cleric and temple servants, they are the farmer at 22, who is, and the 2 people living near the mayor, again, the elves. So she's very good at information, but she will again point you in the wrong direction over who might be up to it. And other people think that she also has some suspicions about other people. For instance, she thinks the people at 19 have gotten very unfriendly lately. That's just because they are scared. A few people also point you towards a hermit on the east side of town in some woods and say maybe he's behind it, but he's actually a wizard who you really want to befriend. Meanwhile, if you end up going to the Golden Grain Inn, there are detailed descriptions and discussions of ambushes and kidnap attempts that might happen to the players there, and they'll get dragged away, potentially suborned and turned into cultists. So who do you listen to? How do you piece the information together? Who do you trust? It's very, very clever, and the sense that you're going to end up, especially as details emerge, especially if time passes and more attempts and kidnap attempts are made, you're going to have an increasing thing where players are like, there's something very weird going on here, and we're in danger if we stay here, and if we're here to solve the problem, we need to find out what's really going on. And I think that's really good. It's something which, though it has an investigation, it's not unique by any means, but it is rare, and that's why I say I think it'd almost be better shown via a spider diagram of accusations and suspicions, because that would perhaps show you just how complex the web is that's going on in the investigation. That's really strong. Other stuff that's really strong, or that I really liked at least, I'd say the actual characters and people around there, like the elves, like the wizard on the edge of town, they are interesting, good characters. The widow, quite memorable. They are high fantasy, haughty fantasy, as I'd call it sometimes. They are pretty traditional in lots of their trope forms, but it's really good. And I think the fact, and they work really well. And I think the fact that you've got, amongst the corrupted members, you've got the chaotic good clerics of the temple who've been turned evil, and that is one of the hearts of the operation. Is very clever. And I don't think anyone says, oh, by the way, don't go to the temple. I think maybe one person says, oh, the clerics, the old woman, I think, says the clerics don't visit her anymore to look after her. But generally speaking, that's something where you may just be like, oh, the players might just go along and think this will be fine, and see it as a potential way to get allies. Now, in terms of, you've basically got 2 dungeons in the town. You have the Temple of Merica, which is well, I mean, it's a whole page. It's got 3 levels and stuff. It's reasonably extensive as a small dungeon. It's a reasonably extensive small dungeon. And the Golden Grain Inn, which is a pretty similar size, which is this one, which is again 3 levels. The Inn of the Slumbering Serpent is a good place, a nice place, and so there's no need to worry about that one. That's not a dungeon. These dungeons are not incredible or anything. I don't think there's any point in pretending that, but they're both very solid. They both, especially because in neither case are they immediately suspected, they could become dangerous quite suddenly or surprisingly. That's good, that's clever. There are a couple of, and in general I think I'd want to say there are plenty of interesting, fiendish, brutal creatures, bad guys, traps, systems like the kidnap attempts at the Golden Grain Inn, or the insane senior cleric at the Temple of America whose scrawlings on the wall you might actually find informative about what's really going on, and the teenage girl he's got trapped in his rooms as well. You know, these dark and interesting moments in the village that I think do work, and which all feed into the general atmosphere of suspicion and fear. But I wouldn't want to say they were amazing, and I think that will continue. We'll get onto this in a moment, but it'll continue on to the main dungeon. You know, interesting, some great stuff, not amazing. Some criticisms to bring up with the village, and in general. Let's just say in general, for now. One, it's wordy. It's not necessarily much more wordy than Homelet, but sometimes it feels like it's lower value. And what I mean is, the question is how far do you want detailed descriptive behaviour of what NPCs do, and how far can you extrapolate? How far in a couple of cases do you need details on the rooms in a particular place? Killian is at work in the stables, but his wife will call after him after any encounter with strangers, and he will hurry to the house. If the party is still in front when he gets there in 2 rounds, he will step outside to apologise for his wife's hastiness. These are strange times, you understand. Unlike many Orlanians, he is affable and willing to carry on a conversation. He will, however, keep his guests on the porch. The livery stable has 6 paragraphs in it, all pretty much like that, including the box text. And the box text is often overblown without having any real value. It's sometimes okay, but often it'd be worthwhile as a sentence or 2 sentences at the start of the next paragraph. So it's 6 paragraphs like that, and this is a social adventure. There is a significant social investigation portion, but nonetheless it feels a bit like you spent too much time and energy getting that stuff down rather than something else. So that's a general criticism, that perhaps it's all a bit overwritten. As a specific example, and there are a couple of examples like this, but this is the one that is really onerous or obnoxious, is the Inn of the Slumbering Serpent, which is, you can see here, and continues after the map booklet with another column. It's basically 2 columns. It's a page of an entirely innocent and innocuous location you will not adventure in. It has such details as storage closet, 8 storage closet. In this closet are extra sheets, pillows, blankets for the bedrooms of the inn. Or again, cellar. This is a large open room supported by 2 central columns. Between the columns are many crates. I'm not going to read this, this is ridiculous. It just describes the inventory. More crates contain stores of food, beans, grain, flour, potatoes, carrots, dried and smoked meat, several kegs of beer. The outside cellar door is locked and barred when not in use. Many long planks. There's nothing, it says at the end, there's nothing here of special interest. That is that long. This is a waste of space. There are other areas which could have been strengthened with this. At least the energy, the effort that Niles put into that could have been put into something else, improving it, redrafting it. This is a horrendous foretelling of things that are going to happen in the future, particularly at dollar per word or cent per word kind of rates. This is ridiculous. You know, you don't need the information, and you're reading through this, and it's taking up headspace as a DM. You don't need taken up by it. The same with it having a map. It has a half-page map nearly as big as one of the dungeons. And again, why not put that into another interesting location, which maybe only takes a column, this other 4th small location. But that's not the main dungeon. But you could do something with that. You could have something interesting there. yeah, so cult activity as time passes. Good as this is an investigation and body snatcher kind of thing, it gives you instructions on that. Again, it's pretty wordy. I would say if you're looking at over a page on that, when in some cases you can kind of giving detailed instructions of how exactly the cult does it, maybe that's good. I want to, in general, the tactics are interesting. The way that Niles is very keen to say, this is what they do, then this, including clever stuff like, these people know to cast silence on coins or rocks and throw them into the midst of spellcasting groups, which is great. That's a great tactic to put there, and something your players will then learn from and learn to adapt to. You know, they will learn to understand and predict the kinds of things that might happen to them. So, you know, because they'll see it once, that if they survive it, they'll learn to cope with it the next time. That's good. That's all fine. Then we get to a very small, it's a page long, because it's 2 columns long, wilderness adventure. And it does say here, an overland journey. So it's got a village, an overland journey, and a challenging underground adventure. The overland journey is a page long out of 28 pages of text. And it's pretty nominal, I would say. It has some stuff about the way to follow trails, way to measure encounters, things like that, and risks like losing the trail means a 1-day delay, subsequent success on it. This is if you don't have someone helping you, if you've just got a ranger in the party or whatever. And yeah, the actual encounters, mostly boring. Dim Forest is goblins, wild boar, troglodytes, ogre, zombies, wolves, black bear, skeletons, that sort of thing. It's pretty nominal. It's not very exciting. You think that, again, maybe if you've got a page nearly on the Inn of the Slumbering Serpent, that could go into the Overland section to add some unique and colourful encounters. There's a separate issue, which is that the map that you see here and the hex references, this is, I guess, from the World of Greyhawk box set, which I use in my own campaign, so it's a very useful, interesting box set. But here, the completely worthless. The trail, I'm going to try to struggle against not having a PDF here for a second, and say Orlane is marked here, but its hex reference is not here. Its hex reference is like over here. The cult is also marked down here. The trail between Orlane and the cult goes here, which does indicate an Orlane that's down here. But the encounters we've got suggest you go through some plains, I guess here, the dim forest, and the swamps. So you can see you have a bunch of stuff at the south of the map that's not marked on the map, where the hex references are therefore very confusing. But the actual map and the terrain you're apparently going through is all in this section here. Another thing that you could have spent extra words on, incidentally, is Hokoch, which is your starting town. Hook Hill through the forest is another place you could go in, which is in Bissell. And this is all in Grand March, by the way, in Greyhawk. Interesting seeing the tie-in, because one suspects it's essentially a nominal product tie-in. It's an add-on sale. Why don't you go and buy the World of Greyhawk setting? You know, that sort of thing. Giving you a sense that Greyhawk is a place in which you buy adventures and build a campaign from the adventures that you buy. That's natural. That's obviously the whole way that TSR and then Wizards have operated since. But yeah, the map is worthless, can't be used as it is. I'm sure there are people who solve this online, so it's not a massive issue now, but you can imagine in 1982 reading this and thinking, this makes no sense. What am I meant to do? I guess you could ring TSR then, couldn't you? I mean, ring up Doug Niles and scream at him. So yeah, weak overland section, basically irrelevant. There's an interesting small giant snapping turtle. Turtles are fun. Having unusual things which are not on the standard list of what people are expecting to fight is always good, but yeah, not exactly exciting. One thing to say in terms of the, and this is a general comment and partially a criticism, is you want to go and get allies in the village. That is obviously a thing you're meant to do, and not everyone's going to be able to help you. Very few of them are levelled. The main person you're looking to befriend is the 7th level magic user Ramney, with his familiar whiskers, and he has a bunch of good stuff. He has a bunch of good spells, up to 4th level, of course. There's a few things here that come up. Ramney, you're basically told you need to get, and if you don't get him, the players, this comes up later in a couple of places, the players need to get access to Minor Globe of Invulnerability so that, and this is jumping ahead, so that the Naga's first move, which is to drop a fireball on the party, can't work. You understand the problem here, that this is something where Niles is over-scripting things and requiring things to happen to make the story work. The elves, when they're convinced that the party is an ally, they'll share their information. They'll not join the group for exploring the town or the dungeon, preferring to work on their own. Given they've been called here by the mayor, and there is a good magic user who ends up hopefully allying with the party, why don't the elves want to help? And isn't it very D&D to be like, well, we've managed to gather all these people together? What happens? This feels like a pretty relevant point. What happens if the 4 to 7 characters, so 7 characters, say big party, plays well? It might well be its second adventure. It might be the pre-rolls. I think are second level. They manage to somehow eliminate the cult in the town, find out what's gone on enough from the prisoner in the temple. And then there's no threat anymore, but you do have a lot of angry townsfolk, 2 elves and a magic user, and the mayor who is himself a fighter, I think a 3rd level fighter possibly, as well as all these other kind of adult potential militiamen and women. He is a 3rd level fighter. And I think, and his bodyguard is a 5th level fighter. If you've eliminated the cult in the town, why wouldn't everyone just join you? And isn't that an interesting thing to let the party succeed at doing? Isn't it more fun to let them build their army rather than be like, yeah, we need to make sure that this doesn't get imbalanced? Which leads me to a point. This comes up in the Temple of America, and it comes up in the Cult HQ as well with Explicit Defiles, and also that separate point about making sure the players get Globe of Minor Invulnerability is basically constantly saying it shows that D&D is changing into a different game. Mutually, I'll put it that way. It's not a game I'm as attracted by. In one way, the fact that it says, look, this might be tough for this level party, so maybe change it. Or maybe it's become too easy, so maybe add a henchman. In a way, I can get behind that. I don't think it's illegitimate for a writer to say, look, and if you think about this, this is something that Raji does in Tower of the Stargazer, and Skirples does, I think, in Serpent Kings, advising DMs about how you might alter stuff depending on your taste and requirements and so on. And so in one way, I can't say I'm against it, but there is an issue here, isn't there, where the assumption is that the goal of the game, and it's an emphasis on game rather than simulation here, in that sense, is to get a good fight out of this thing and to have it be fun. Hence why it's more entertaining if the fireball bounces off a minor globe rather than kills everyone. And you're like, well, yeah, maybe it is more entertaining, but maybe the players should work that out. There's a general point here that you're like, why is this second? He says, oh, there's probably enough XP and treasure to get them to at least second, and the pre-gens are second themselves, so there's maybe an assumption they'll go from second to third over the course of the adventure. You're like, why is this 2nd or 3rd level party just charging around fighting? There's like wights, there's a wraith level undead, there's a spirit naga with fireball. I'm not saying low level parties shouldn't do sometimes over challenging stuff, partly because they can succeed, but it's a weird difficulty curve that then gets these weird comments about, oh, by the way, you might want to alter this because it's too tough. Nonetheless, and that's not a big complaint in the sense it's easily ignored, but it indicates to me a mindset about a linearity, including with this relatively lame Overland section, which indicates that that Niles has not necessarily understood the way in which Gygax sets up location-based adventures. By that I mean that the giant stuff is all, it is railroaded in terms of if you want to run it, it just says, oh yeah, they go to a teleport point, then they go to a teleport point, it's fine. But the actual locations are open to manipulation, and they are also easily dumped out in the world. You don't have to tie them to the adventure, and the tournament structure is very, very nominal. And the same somewhat with, say, even T1, where and T1 I actually think is a module, obviously, as most people would agree, a module with some significant problems. It's amazing, it's a classic, but it has a couple of serious issues. but it doesn't heavily direct the players towards the moat house. In fact, one flaw is that precisely that it doesn't give a rounded environment where the players can go around and, via stuff in the book, find out what's going on. To some degree, there's a sense that you're like, well, hopefully they'll eventually find out, and then they'll go to the moat house. And hopefully they won't all die because there's giant frogs at the front. So you get the idea that it's something here that there's a way in which, in the middle of this very interesting open social adventure, players are being driven and pushed towards a particular set of actions with a particular set of tools that are very limited, but which are then somewhat balanced by the fact that you're being told to manipulate the difficulty behind the scenes. And I think a better adventure is one which is more resilient to player activity, basically. So yeah, that's that. To talk briefly, I guess, about the main dungeon, I should say a big thing in its favour in terms of one school of dungeon design at least, and it's one I generally side with, is that you do have pretty reasonable looping. I mean, it's pretty generic looping. By that I mean it's essentially just squares with interlinks. It's an outer square with some interlinks, and then below it's more or less an outer square with interlinks. But that's fine. Add a functional getting your party to enjoy mapping and finding puzzles, and having that kind of first gen exploration as puzzle type game. I think that's a completely adequate approach. And so yeah, I think the maps are fine. I think the dungeon, the Explictica, technically Explicita as most people seem to say it, Explictica Defiance has a very strange menagerie. It's a 37 room dungeon, so it's small medium, I'd say medium size over 2 levels. It has some really great monsters and traps. Again, just pretty brutal stuff, and good tactics too, as I've said before. The troglodytes in room 33, who are camouflaged, waiting for them, surprising the party on a 1 to 4. One of them tries to break a frail wicker cage to let out an enraged mud viper, and so on. One general point here actually is that the treasure is often interestingly presented, such as the troglodytes have just buried sacks in loose dirt in their kind of muddy, unpleasant area. So though there is plenty of stuff there, a equivalent of a couple of thousand gold, it's not something which, or just over 1,000 gold, I think. It's not something players will automatically find, despite the fact that for a tooled up party, maybe at 2nd or 3rd level by the end, it won't necessarily be an incredibly hard encounter by that point. Nonetheless, it's the treasure is not necessarily easy to find from there, and there's a few examples like that of well done treasure, just hiding it or putting it in interesting places that requires puzzle skills, in that sense the kind of simulation puzzle skills where you're thinking out the environment to find. Of course, that's the classic attention in early D&D is it wants to be sometimes both a serious simulation and a almost abstracted game at the same time, in a way that if you read a modern wizards module, it turns out modern wizards don't want to be either, and they have a completely different objective in mind. The harpy who can just fly down and will just blind people. If she grabs you and captures you, she blinds you. Again, the mud trap, which gnomes or a find traps check might be able to find, but which basically, as soon as you open the chest, it triggers a thing where the whole thing collapses, mud pours everywhere. You can try to rescue people, but if you fail to, you can then fail to escape too, and if you fail to escape, you die. Pretty brutal traps, but in both cases, both the harpy, to a degree the harpy, and definitely the mud traps, are ones which are parts of fairly normal, searchable, workable environments where you work stuff out. And where if you know that the mud where the harpy is going to grab you is thick and deep and will trap you, you might be a bit cautious about going into it, especially if you think that there are hostiles around. The mud trap, there's a chest in the room, in this otherwise weird empty room. You're going to check out the supports, things like that. Players will do that, so those are good puzzles. On the other hand, there is a degree of monster hotel here, not just because there's a bunch of trogs who they've captured and charmed. there's human cult members, but really there's a green slime, and there's 2 killer frogs, and there are crocodiles, and there's the harpy, of course. There's a giant weasel. There's lots of troglodytes. There's a huge spider. There is an evil cleric. There are giant centipedes. This is the best of the box text, by the way. This open area is choked with mud. And yeah, and there's a bone snapper, which is a turtle as well. Oh, well, miniature Tyrannosaurus Rex in that case. I thought a bone snapper was a turtle-like thing, but no, apparently not. One interesting thing, by the way, here is in terms of ethical dilemmas. There are 1,000 troglodyte eggs, some beginning to crack open. Do you commit genocide or not? Because otherwise there's going to be a big issue of vicious humanoids, of sentient humanoids. So yeah, Explictica herself, I think, is a cool monster for an encounter. Not a particularly interesting villain, because there's no sense of, other than wanting to be a goddess, what's going on. No real interaction that's ever going to happen between her and the party, realistically. So you're going to have to expand that. But it's an atmospheric and cool villain. There she is. The dungeon is the weaker half. There are lots of good things about it. I wouldn't want to do down the clever interactions, the very functional map, like the interesting map, the opportunity for exploration thereby, the way that some of the harder puzzles or traps or opportunities for treasure are signalled and open to player interaction. But it's also one note, very combat heavy. I don't think, apart from rescuing the civilians who are there, and that's good if you can do that, they can't help you, so you just want to get them out. In that sense, there's no factional dynamic inside. That is also fine. Base Assault doesn't have to have factional dynamic. But there's not really anything else going on in this sometimes somewhat unnaturalistic environment. A general point here to take from that, which you might have picked up, I've said already, is also that it is a tough adventure for a 2nd or 3rd level party. Hence the gimmicks about getting new spells. But yeah, what do I think? I think it is a really interesting module. I think it has a nearly unique investigation section, a social adventure, which is very rare in early D&D. The kind of social adventure it is, I mean, there are social adventures, but the detail put in makes it just really interesting and worthwhile. And I recommend it for that alone. If you want to learn something about writing those adventures, do. Doug Niles was an often interesting writer who I think increasingly gets undone by the development of D&D. And I say you look at something like the Mazdaca box set, which has a lot of good ideas and interesting bits and pieces, and if you like battle system, it has some really good scenarios in it. But by that point, you've got something which is, even as a straight setting box, really isn't usable. It's a bunch of good ideas and some setting info which isn't always directly gameable. You have to do an extra step. Very strange thing. Not terrible, but really not good. Here, you probably have him at his best, and you can tolerate the issues with overwriting and a couple of just flat or weird sections, like the good guy inn that doesn't even need to be in there, or the boring overland section, for the fact that there are a bunch of good ideas, hard, challenging sections, and this amazing social adventure. Is it in the top 10 first edition modules? Quite probably. That's probably because first edition, or if it's not, it's just outside. First edition, of course, when you think from 77 to 89, is it, or something? It's not like you have an enormous corpus from of the really good stuff. It might just fall out of it if you really like your UK stuff and your UK plus U generally. Then it'll fall out of it. Is it in the top 10 of basic OD&D and first? Probably not, because at that point you're starting to deal with some very, very good B series stuff, B and X series stuff basically, and that's going to knock it down further. Where is it in terms of early low level adventures? It has to be one of the most interesting, even if there are some, a bit like T1, some weird wonky things that make it unfriendly for a low level party. people I think sometimes say, oh no, this is more appropriate for newbies than T1. I'm not sure it is, in the sense that I think the ability to judge danger is going to be very limited given how weirdly difficult parts of the early adventure are. So if you're seeing it as a training exercise, it's going to teach them hard lessons, but it's going to teach them in a very hard way. But yeah, I really like Against the Cult of the Reptile God. I think it is well worth sticking in the world, particularly if you're playing Greyhawk, I guess. It could do with a bit of work, a bit of polishing, much like T1 could. But it doesn't mean either of them are not great classic modules. And certainly for Douglas Niles, it has to represent the high point of his career. If you have run this or played this, tell me what you think in the comments. And I guess, yeah, also throw out your favourite first edition modules. Till next time.